The lawyer
DNA
called my
results
name and the
confirm that
room
the
went dead
shares belong
silent.
solely to
My
Miss Carter
mother-in-law
Webb.
dropped her wine glass. My husband's mistress started screaming. And me, I was still wearing the same black dress I had worn to scrub their toilets that morning. For 6 years, they treated me like I was invisible.
In the latest
Like I was
development of the
nothing.
scandal,
The
new
waitress
evidence
who
has
got
emerged
lucky,
suggesting
the
widespread
charity case
corruption
who
at the
married
highest
above her
levels.
station.
We expect a
They
statement
laughed
shortly.
at me behind my back. They made me eat in the kitchen while they dined in crystal and gold. My own husband called me a drowned rat
As you
at
can
his
see,
father's
the evidence
funeral.
is undeniable.
But here is what they did not know. The old man saw everything. He documented everything. And he left me the keys to destroy them all. This is the story of how an ignored wife walked into a well, reading and walked out owning a billion-dollar empire. Stay with me. You are going to want to hear every word of this. The lawyer said my name, and 17 people stopped breathing. My mother-in-law's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor, sending red droplets across her designer shoes like blood spatter at a crime scene. My husband's mistress, yes, she was there, started screaming something about fraud and manipulation. And me? I was still wearing the same black dress I had worn to scrub their toilets that morning. But in 60 seconds, I would own everything they had ever touched. Let me tell you how a waitress from Tulsa, Oklahoma, ended up destroying the most powerful family in Seattle. Because this story is not about revenge. It is about a woman who finally learned that being underestimated was her greatest weapon. My name is Elena Carter Webb. At least that was my name when this story began. I was 34 years old, married for 6 years to a man named Bradley Webb, and I had spent every single one of those years trying to earn a place at a table that was never meant for me. The Webb family owned in Webb Maritime Industries. If you have ever ordered anything online that came from overseas, chances are it traveled on one of their ships. Charles Webb, my father-in-law, built the company from nothing. One rusty fishing boat in a dream, as he used to say. By the time he died, the company was worth over $2 billion. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started. The funeral, the rain, and the moment I realized that love was not enough to save me. October 14th in Seattle was always gray. But this particular October 14th felt like the sky itself was mourning. Rain hammered against the black umbrellas of the mourners gathered around the grave of Charles James Webb. He was 72 years old when his heart gave out. At least, that is what the doctors said at the time. I stood at the edge of the crowd, not under the large heated canopy reserved for immediate family, but in the mud near the cemetery fence. My umbrella had flipped inside out twice already from the wind, and I had given up trying to fix it. Water dripped down my face, mixing with tears I did not want anyone to see. From where I stood, I could see the back of my husband's head. Bradley Webb, 40 years old, golden boy of the family, vice president of the company his father built. He was wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than my father made in an entire year back in Tulsa. His arm was not around me. It was draped around his mother, Margaret. Margaret Webb was 68 years old and made entirely of ice and diamonds. Even at her husband's funeral, she looked less like a grieving widow and more like a queen waiting for her coronation. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the rain. Her black Chanel dress probably cost more than my car. And when she turned her head slightly to scan the crowd, her eyes landing on me like I was something unpleasant she had stepped in, I felt my stomach drop. She did not say anything. She did not have to. That tiny sneer, that micro expression of pure disgust, said everything. You do not belong here. You never did. You never will. I shivered. Not from the cold, from 6 years of marriage that had slowly stripped away every layer of my self-worth. The priest finished his prayer. Amen, the crowd murmured in unison. I mouthed the word, but no sound came out. As people began moving toward the line of black limousines waiting on the cemetery road, I stepped forward, my shoes squelched in the mud as I approached Bradley. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and touched his sleeve. Bradley, I whispered, can I ride with you? My shoes are completely soaked through. He spun around so fast I stumbled backward. His face twisted into something ugly, though he smoothed it away quickly when he noticed a photographer nearby. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. Do not embarrass me, Elena. His voice was low, venomous, meant only for my ears. The limo is full. Mother needs space to grieve. You can take the sedan with the household staff. But I am your wife. The words came out smaller than I intended, almost like a question instead of a statement. And maybe that was the problem. After 6 years, I was no longer sure if the word wife meant anything at all. Then act like it and stop making scenes, Bradley snapped. He brushed off his sleeve where I had touched him, as if my fingers had left some kind of stain. And for God's sake, fix your hair. You look like a drowned rat. It is disrespectful to my father's memory. He turned and walked away without looking back. I watched him slide into the back of the lead Mercedes, the door closing with a solid, expensive thunk. Through the tinted window, I could see him pull out his phone. He was smiling, texting someone, not grieving. I knew who he was texting. Nicole Ashford, his executive assistant at the company. I had found out about her 18 months ago when Bradley came home from a business trip smelling like perfume I did not own. When his business trips to Phoenix started coinciding perfectly with Nicole's Instagram posts from the same hotels. I had stayed silent, not because I was stupid, not because I was weak, but because of a promise I had made to the man we were burying today. 3 days before he died, Charles Webb had gripped my hand with surprising strength. He was lying in his hospital bed, machines beeping around him, his voice barely a whisper. "Wait," he had rasped. "Promise me you will wait until the reading of the will. Do not leave my son yet. Promise me, Elena." So I waited, standing in the rain at his funeral, alone. An older man in a chauffeur's uniform appeared beside me with a large umbrella. Thomas. He had been Charles's driver for over 20 years. His eyes were red-rimmed from crying, something I had not seen from anyone else in the family. "I am sorry, Mrs. Webb," Thomas said softly. "They should not treat you this way." I gave him a tired smile. "It is okay, Thomas. I am used to it. Mr. Charles thought the world of you." Thomas opened the back door of an older gray sedan. He saw everything, even when people thought he was sleeping. "He talked about you like you were the daughter he never had." I slid into the back seat, my wet coat squeaking against the leather. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. I had become very good at blinking back tears over the past 6 years. "Thomas," I said before he closed the door, "why do you think he asked me to wait?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned down, his voice low. "Because Mr. Charles knew exactly what his family was, and he made plans accordingly. Just wait for the reading, Mrs. Webb. I think you might be surprised." The door closed, the engine started. And as we pulled away from the cemetery, I pressed my hand against my stomach, against the secret I had been keeping for 3 months now. I was pregnant, 16 weeks along, and I had not told a single soul. Here is the thing about being invisible in a wealthy family. You see everything, you hear everything, because no one thinks to guard their words around the help. And that is exactly what I had become. Not a wife, not a partner, not even a human being worthy of basic respect. Just another staff member who happened to share Bradley's last name. In 6 years of marriage, I had learned to move through the Webb mansion like a ghost. I organized the household. I planned the parties. I made sure Margaret's favorite flowers were always fresh and Bradley's suits were always pressed. I smiled at charity events and kept my mouth shut at family dinners. And I documented everything. I did not know why I started keeping records. Maybe it was something Charles said to me once, about knowledge being the only thing they could never take away. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the small, stubborn part of me that refused to disappear completely. But for 4 years, I had kept a journal. Every receipt I found in Bradley's pockets, every cruel comment documented with dates and times, every suspicious charge on the credit card statements that came to the house. I did not have a plan for what to do with any of it. I just knew that in a world where my word meant nothing against theirs, I needed proof that I existed. The Webb mansion was empty when we arrived. The rest of the family had gone to some exclusive club for a private gathering. I was not invited. I was never invited. I changed out of my wet clothes and wandered through the silent house, my footsteps echoing on the marble floors. I ended up in Charles's study, a room that still smelled like his pipe tobacco even though he had quit smoking 10 years ago. His desk was covered in papers that would need to be sorted. His books lined the walls, leather-bound volumes he had actually read, unlike the decorative collections in the rest of the house. I ran my fingers along the spines until I found the one he had given me 2 years ago. a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. I pulled it off the shelf and a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. I picked it up. Charles's handwriting, shaky but legible. Elena, keep reading, keep learning. Knowledge is the only thing they cannot take from you. And when the time comes, remember that you are stronger than you know. With love. See, I pressed the note to my chest and finally let myself cry. 3 days after the funeral, I sat in the corner of a conference room at Holloway and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Seattle. The office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, all chrome and leather, and the kind of quiet that only extreme wealth can buy. The conference room was dominated by a mahogany table long enough to seat 20 people, but only 6 chairs were occupied. Margaret sat at one end, her posture rigid, her fingers drumming against the wood with barely contained impatience. Bradley sat to her right, checking his phone, looking bored. His younger brother Marcus slouched to Margaret's left, his eyes bloodshot and his expensive suit wrinkled like he had slept in it. Marcus was 32 years old and had never held a real job in his life. He had failed at 3 different startup companies, all funded by his father's money. His current occupation, as far as I could tell, was professional gambler and disappointment. And then there was Nicole. I still do not understand how Bradley had the audacity to bring his mistress to his father's will reading. She sat beside him in a tight black dress that showed too much cleavage for a legal proceeding, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, her hand occasionally touching Bradley's arm in a way that was just possessive enough to make a statement. I sat against the wall, away from the table, in a chair that had clearly been added as an afterthought. I had tried to sit at the table when I first arrived. Margaret had looked at me like I had suggested we order pizza. "This is a private family matter, Elena," she had said without even glancing in my direction. "Staff can wait against the wall." "I am not staff," I had replied quietly. "I am Bradley's wife." Bradley had sighed heavily. "Just sit over there, Elena. You will not understand the legal jargon anyway." Try not to speak, so I sat, and I waited, and I watched. The door opened and attorney James Holloway walked in. He was in his mid-60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a stern professor. He carried a thick leather folder and did not smile at anyone. I had met Mr. Holloway once before, briefly, at a company event. He had been kind to me, asked about my hometown, actually listened to my answers. It was such a small thing, being listened to, but in the Webb family it was remarkable. "Good morning," Mr. Holloway said, his voice gravelly from decades of courtroom arguments. He walked to the head of the table, forcing Margaret to shift her chair aside, a subtle power move that I appreciated. "Let us get on with it, James," Marcus said, leaning forward. "I have a flight to Las Vegas at 6. Mr. Holloway looked at him over his glasses. "Patience, Marcus. Your father's instructions were very specific about how this reading should proceed." He opened the folder. The sound of paper shuffling was the only noise in the room. Even Nicole stopped fidgeting. "We are here today to execute the last will and testament of Charles James Webb," Mr. Holloway began. "Before I read the specific bequests, I want to note that Mr. Webb updated this will 3 times in the past 6 months. The version I am reading is dated September 28th of this year, 16 days before his death." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Why was he changing his will so frequently? "That will become clear," Mr. Holloway said. He did not elaborate. He simply began reading. "First, regarding liquid assets, to my sister Beatrice, whom I have not spoken to in 15 years, I leave the sum of $10,000, on the condition that she uses it to take a vow of silence." Marcus snorted. Dad's sense of humor, right to the end. Margaret did not smile. "Continue, James. To my loyal household staff, Thomas Warren, my driver, Martha Gonzalez, my cook, and Robert Henderson, my groundskeeper. I leave $500,000 each, tax-free, in recognition of their years of dedicated service." Bradley slammed his hand on the table. $500,000 for the gardener? That is absurd. We will contest this immediately." Mr. Holloway did not flinch. "You will contest nothing, Bradley. This will is ironclad. It was prepared with full legal counsel and witnessed by 3 independent parties. Your father was of completely sound mind. Do not interrupt me again." I watched Bradley's jaw clench. He was not used to being spoken to that way, but even he knew better than to argue with James Holloway. The lawyer continued, To my wife, Margaret Elizabeth Webb, I leave the lakeside estate in Geneva, Switzerland, the jewelry collection currently in her possession, and a monthly stipend of $25,000 for the remainder of her life. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. A stipend? $25,000 a month? That barely covers my country club membership. Where is the capital? Where are the stocks? Where is my share of the company? Mr. Holloway looked at her without sympathy. The stipend is contingent on you not remarrying. If you remarry, it ceases immediately. Additionally, Mr. Holloway paused, as if choosing his words carefully. Charles left a note explaining this bequest. Would you like me to read it? Of course I want you to read it, Margaret snapped. Mr. Holloway pulled out a separate piece of paper. Very well. To Margaret, we were married for 42 years. For the first 12, I loved you. For the next 30, I tolerated you. You spent my money on pool boys and plastic surgery while I built an empire. You slept in a separate bedroom and treated our marriage like a business arrangement. I am returning the favor. The stipend is generous considering you contributed nothing to the company's success except expensive taste. Live within your means for once. Charles. Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. Her hands were shaking. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. This is an outrage, she whispered. I will sue. I will have this overturned. I was his wife for over 4 decades. Mr. Holloway simply moved to the next page. To my son, Marcus Anthony Webb, I leave my collection of vintage automobiles valued at approximately $4 million. However, they are held in a trust. You may drive them, you may not sell them. If you attempt to sell them, they will be donated to charity. Additionally, your trust fund of $5 million will only be accessible after you have completed a certified rehabilitation program for gambling addiction and maintained sobriety for 1 full year. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. He needed cash to pay off gambling debts. Cars he could not sell were worthless to him. He cannot do this, Marcus muttered. I need the money now. He can, and he did, Mr. Holloway replied. He turned to Bradley. And finally, to my eldest son, Bradley Charles Webb. Bradley straightened in his chair. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The company, the billions, his inheritance. I leave the family home in Saddle and my seat on the board of directors of Webb Maritime Industries. Bradley exhaled, a massive grin spreading across his face. The house and the board seat. That is the control. I knew Dad would not leave me hanging. However, Mr. Holloway said, raising one finger, the board seat is merely a position. It carries no controlling interest. Your father owns 60% of Webb Maritime Industries. That 60% represents the controlling stake of the entire company. Yes, give me the shares. Bradley was practically bouncing in his chair. He held out his hand like he expected Mr. Holloway to place them directly in his palm. Mr. Holloway closed the folder partially. He removed his glasses and polished them slowly. The room held its breath. Then he looked past Bradley, past Margaret, past Marcus and Nicole. He looked at me. Mrs. Webb, he said, and for the first time his voice softened. Would you please join us at the table? I felt my heart stop, actually stop, like someone had pressed pause on my entire existence. I looked around, certain he must be talking to Margaret. Bradley laughed nervously. She is right there, James. My mother is sitting right in front of you. No, Mr. Holloway said firmly. I mean Mrs. Elena Carter Webb. Everyone turned to stare at me. Nicole's perfectly painted lips fell open. Marcus blinked like he had forgotten I was in the room, which, to be fair, he probably had. I stood up. My legs felt like they were made of water. Somehow I managed to walk to the empty chair across from Bradley and lower myself into it. Why are you calling her over? Bradley scoffed. Did Dad leave her a tea set, a vacuum cleaner? Mr. Holloway ignored him. He opened the folder again, turned to the final page and began to read. To Elena, the person who sat by my hospital bed during chemotherapy when my family was vacationing in the south of France. The person who learned my medication schedule and made sure I never missed a dose. The person who read my business reports aloud to me when my eyesight failed, even though she did not understand them at first. The person who brought me tea every night and listened to my stories about the old days. The only person in this family who showed me genuine kindness in my final years. Mr. Holloway paused. His eyes met mine. There was something almost like respect in them. I leave the controlling 60% stake in Webb Maritime Industries, all offshore accounts totaling $180 million, the position of chairman and CEO, and complete authority over the employment status of all family members within the company. He set the paper down. Elena Carter Webb is now the sole owner and decision maker of Webb Maritime Industries. The next 3 days were a blur of case, lawyers, and shocked faces. I moved into Charles's old office at Webb Maritime headquarters. It felt wrong at first, sitting in his leather chair, looking at his view of the Seattle skyline. But Thomas, who I had promoted to head of security, reminded me that Charles wanted me there. He had planned for this. He had believed in me when no one else did. I did not fire Bradley immediately. Part of me still could not believe any of this was real. Part of me kept expecting to wake up back in the corner of that conference room, invisible and ignored. But reality set in quickly. On my third day as CEO, I walked into a board meeting and announced that I would be conducting a full financial audit of the company. The room went silent. 7 middle-aged men in expensive suits stared at me like I had just suggested we convert all our ships to paper boats. One of them, a man named Gerald Thornton, who had been on the board for 20 years, actually laughed. "Mrs. Webb," he said, with the kind of condescension that rich men seem to learn at birth, "perhaps you should leave the finances to those of us who understand them. You could focus on, I do not know, redecorating the break room." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I pulled out a folder I had spent all night preparing. "Mr. Thornton," I said calmly, "according to my research, you approved a consulting contract 3 years ago for a company called Thornton Advisors. That company is owned by your wife. The contract paid $400,000 for services that were never rendered. Would you like to explain that before I contact the Securities and Exchange Commission?" Gerald Thornton stopped laughing. "Does anyone else have suggestions about what I should focus on?" I asked the room. No one spoke. "The audit will begin Monday," I continued. "I expect full cooperation from every department. This meeting is adjourned." I walked out feeling powerful for the first time in my life. Diane Torres, my new executive assistant and the only person in the building I actually trusted, fell into step beside me. Diane was 45 years old, sharp as a tack, and had worked as a housekeeper for the Webb family for 8 years before I promoted her. What most people did not know was that she had been a paralegal before her divorce destroyed her financially. Her ex-husband had hidden assets, manipulated the courts, and left her with nothing. She understood betrayal, she understood survival, and she understood me. "That was incredible," Diane said as we walked down the hallway. "You just made a grown man turn the color of cottage cheese." "He had it coming," I replied. "They all do." I spent the next week learning everything I could about the company my father-in-law had built. I read financial reports until my eyes burned. I met with department heads who looked at me with barely concealed skepticism. I asked questions that probably seemed basic, but I did not care. I would rather look ignorant now than make ignorant decisions later. And then, exactly 1 week after I took control, everything fell apart. I was in my office reviewing shipping contracts when my lawyer called. His name was David Chen, a young attorney I had hired specifically because he was not connected to the Webb family in any way. "Elena," he said without preamble, "we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Margaret filed a lawsuit this morning. She is claiming undue influence. Says Charles had dementia when he wrote the will and that you manipulated him into leaving you everything." I felt ice spread through my chest. Charles did not have dementia. He was sharp until the very end. "I know that," David said, "but she has 3 doctors willing to testify that he was mentally compromised. They were all on the Webb family payroll for years. She also has statements from household staff saying you isolated him from the family in his final months. That is ridiculous. The family ignored him. I was the only one who visited. I believe you. But here is the bad news. She got a judge to issue an emergency order. All company shares are frozen pending investigation. You are still technically CEO, but you cannot make any major decisions without board approval. And without your voting shares, the board is controlled by Bradley's allies." I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a full minute. Then I turned on my computer and searched for my name. The headlines made my stomach turn. Web Industries CEO, former criminal, rags to riches, or gold digger. The Elena Carter Webb story. Shoplifting scandal rocks Seattle's elite. Bradley had leaked my arrest record to the press. When I was 19 years old, broke and desperate, I had stolen baby formula and diapers from a convenience store. Not for myself. For my neighbor, a single mother whose baby was sick and who could not afford food. The charges were dropped when I completed community service, but the arrest remained on my record. In the Webb family's hands, it became proof that I was a criminal who had schemed her way into a fortune. My office phone rang. I answered without thinking. "Hello, Mrs. CEO." Bradley's voice oozed through the speaker like oil. "Enjoying your first week? What do you want, Bradley?" "I want to offer you a deal. Sign over the shares voluntarily, walk away with $5 million, and we will make all of this go away. The lawsuit, the press stories, everything." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "You embezzled millions from this company to buy your mistress an apartment. You cheated on me for years. And now you want me to walk away? You have no proof of anything, Elena. And even if you did, who would believe you? You are a waitress from Oklahoma. I am a Webb. This is my family's company. It was always going to end this way. You just got confused for a minute and thought you were one of us." He paused. "Take the deal, Elena. Because if you do not, I will destroy you so completely that you will wish you had never left that diner in Tulsa." The line went dead. I sat in Charles's chair, surrounded by Charles's things, and I thought about giving up. $5 million was more money than I had ever imagined having. I could go back to Oklahoma, buy a little house, raise my baby far away from these people. My baby. I pressed my hand against my stomach. 17 weeks now. Still barely showing. Still my secret. And then I thought about what Charles had said to me near the end when he was too weak to do more than whisper. "They will try to break you, Elena. After I am gone, they will come for everything I gave you. But you are stronger than you know. You have something they do not have." "What is that?" I had asked. "You actually care about something other than money. And that will make all the difference." I picked up the phone and called David Chen. "Do not accept anything from Margaret's lawyers," I said. "We are going to fight this. Elena, the odds are not good. She has resources and connections that will take years to overcome." "Then I guess we better get started," I replied. "Find me the best forensic accountant in the city, and see if you can get Charles's medical records from an independent source. If he had dementia, there should be evidence. And if he did not, I want proof." I hung up and turned to find Diane standing in my doorway. Her face was pale. "Elena," she said quietly, "have you watched the news today?" I shook my head. "I have been avoiding it. You need to see this." Diane walked over and turned on the small television mounted on my office wall. Nicole Ashford's face filled the screen. She was sitting on a morning talk show couch, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while a sympathetic host patted her hand. "I never wanted to come forward," Nicole was saying, "but I cannot stay silent while an innocent man is being destroyed by a vengeful woman." "Who is being destroyed?" the host asked. "Bradley Webb," Nicole replied. Her voice caught with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "The truth is, Bradley and I have been in a relationship for 2 years. I know that sounds terrible, but his marriage was already over. Elena refused to give him a divorce. She trapped him." The host leaned forward. "Are you saying the marriage was abusive?" Bradley was afraid of her. Nicole nodded earnestly. "She manipulated his father, turned him against his own family. And now she is using the inheritance to punish Bradley for wanting to leave her." She wiped her eyes. "But there is something else you should know. Something I have not told anyone." The host waited breathlessly. "I am pregnant." Nicole placed a hand on her stomach. "With Bradley's child. And Elena Webb has threatened to destroy us both." She looked directly into the camera. "Elena, if you are watching, I am not afraid of you. Bradley and I are going to fight for our family." Diane turned off the television. I stood frozen. "Is any of that true?" Diane asked carefully. "She is pregnant," I said numbly. "I found a positive test in Bradley's coat pocket a month ago, but the rest of it is complete lies. I never refused a divorce. Bradley never asked for one. I was never abusive to anyone." "I know," Diane said, "but the public does not know that. And right now, Nicole looks like a brave pregnant woman standing up to a bitter wife. I walked to the window and stared out at the city. Somewhere down there, people were going about their normal lives, drinking coffee, taking their kids to school, not having their entire existence destroyed on national television. "Diane," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something. What is it?" I turned around. "I am pregnant too, 4 months along, and Bradley is the father." Diane's eyes went wide. "Does Bradley know?" "No one knows. I was waiting for the right time to announce it. I thought maybe at a board meeting, to show the company that Charles's legacy would continue through his grandchild." "Elena." Diane crossed the room and took my hands. "You need to tell people. Fight fire with fire." I shook my head. "If I announce it now, right after Nicole, it will look like I am lying to compete with her. No one will believe me. Then what are we going to do?" I pulled my hands free and walked back to my desk. I sat down in Charles's chair, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than fear. I felt angry. "We are going to find the truth," I said, "about the money Bradley stole, about what Margaret knew and when, about Nicole and whatever game she is really playing." "That could take months," Diane pointed out. "Years even. Then we better not waste any time." I opened my laptop and started making a list of everything I needed to investigate. I did not know it yet, but the truth was going to be far worse than I ever imagined. The next month was the worst of my life, and I say that as someone who grew up poor in Oklahoma, worked double shifts through college, and married into a family that treated me like garbage for 6 years. None of that compared to what came next. Disaster number one arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Charles's medical records. I had hired a private investigator to track down the independent physicians who Charles had seen in his final months. David Chen warned me that what we found might not be what I wanted to hear. I should have listened. "Elena," David said over the phone, bowing. His voice was gentle, which was somehow worse than if he had been blunt. The records came back. Charles did have early-stage cognitive decline. It was not full dementia, but it was significant enough that Margaret's lawyers can use it. I sat down hard in my office chair. How significant? His neurologist noted memory issues, confusion about dates, occasional difficulty recognizing people. It was early stage and progressing slowly, but it was documented. "So Margaret is telling the truth?" "She is telling a version of the truth," David said carefully. "The fact that Charles had some cognitive issues does not mean he was incompetent when he wrote the will, but it gives her ammunition. It makes the case murkier. The judge might decide to throw out the will entirely and let it go to probate. What happens then? Then everything gets divided according to state law. Margaret gets the largest share as the surviving spouse. The sons split the rest. You get nothing." I hung up and stared at the wall for a very long time. Disaster number two came 3 days later, in a courtroom. The preliminary hearing for Margaret's lawsuit required testimony from family members. I expected Bradley to lie. I expected Nicole to play the victim. I even expected Margaret to deliver her Ice Queen performance. I did not expect Marcus. Funny thing about Marcus Webb, of all the Webbs, he was the one who had shown me occasional kindness over the years. When Bradley was cruel at family dinners, Marcus would sometimes catch my eye and give me a sympathetic look. Once, he even apologized for his brother's behavior. When I took over the company, I had not fired him. I had offered him a chance to prove himself, to work his way up legitimately for once in his life. So when he took the stand at the preliminary hearing and testified against me, I felt something inside me break. Mrs. Webb, meaning Elena, was always hovering around my father in his final months, Marcus said, not meeting my eyes. She controlled who could see him. She read his business documents to him and sometimes suggested changes. I believe she was manipulating him. The opposing lawyer smiled like a shark. "And did your father seem mentally competent during this time?" Marcus hesitated. Then he said, "He was confused sometimes. He called me by the wrong name once. He forgot my birthday." I watched him step down from the witness stand. He finally looked at me, and I saw shame in his eyes. After the hearing, he caught me in the hallway. "Elena, I am sorry." His voice was barely a whisper. "I am so sorry. Mother promised to pay my gambling debts if I testified. I owe $300,000 to people who will hurt me if I do not pay. I did not have a choice." I stared at him. "Everyone has a choice, Marcus. You made yours." I walked away. Disaster number 3 was the worst. 2 weeks after Marcus's betrayal, I woke up in the middle of the night with sharp pains in my abdomen. I called Diane in a panic and she drove me to the emergency room. The waiting room was crowded at 3 in the morning. A crying baby, a man with a bloody bandage on his hand, an elderly woman coughing into a tissue. I filled out forms with shaking hands, lying about my emergency contact because I could not bring myself to put Bradley's name. When they finally called me back, a young nurse took my blood pressure and asked routine questions. Then she said, "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your pregnancy." I froze. "How do you know I am pregnant?" She looked confused. "It is in your medical records, Mrs. Webb. You have been receiving prenatal care for 4 months. I have been keeping it private," I said quickly. "Please do not tell anyone, please." Her face softened. "All medical information is confidential, Mrs. Webb. No one will hear it from us." But someone did hear it, because the next morning the press had a new headline. "Webb heiress claims pregnancy. Is she lying for sympathy?" Bradley filed an emergency motion that afternoon, demanding a paternity test. His lawyers argued that I had deliberately concealed the pregnancy and might have gotten pregnant specifically to manipulate the inheritance proceedings. They suggested, without saying it outright, that the baby might not even be his. The tabloids went wild. Gold digger or cheater? The Elena Webb scandal deepens. I spent the next 48 hours in bed, following doctor's orders to rest and reduce stress. My blood pressure was too high. The baby was fine, but the pregnancy was now considered high risk. Diane brought me soup and sat with me while I cried. "Maybe I should just give up," I said. My voice was hoarse from crying. "Let them have it all. I just want my baby to be okay." Diane took my hand. "Mija, listen to me. I gave up once. My ex-husband took everything, and I told myself peace was more important than justice. You know what I got? No peace. Just poverty and regret, and the knowledge that a bad man won because I let him." She squeezed my fingers. "Do not let them win, Elena. Not like this. Not when you have done nothing wrong." I looked at her. "How do we fight back? They have money, connections, the press on their side. What do I have?" "You have the truth," Diane said, "and you have me. And according to Charles's will, you have enough money to hire the best investigators and lawyers in the country. Use it." I thought about her words for a long time after she left. Charles had believed in me. He had seen something in me that no one else had. He had trusted me with his life's work, with his legacy. Was I really going to give up without a fight? The next morning, I called David Chen. "I want you to hire a full investigation team," I said. "Forensic accountants, private investigators, whoever you need. I want to know everything about Nicole Ashford, where she came from, who she really is, and what she was doing at this company before Bradley." "That could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars," David warned. "I have hundreds of millions of dollars," I replied. "Frozen or not, I can still access the legal defense fund Charles set up. Use it." What are we looking for exactly? I do not know yet. But there is something wrong about this whole situation. Nicole appeared out of nowhere 2 years ago, got close to Bradley, and now she is pregnant and publicly declaring war on me. I want to know why. You think there is more to her story? I think Charles taught me that nothing in business happens by accident. And I am starting to wonder if Nicole Ashford is playing a longer game than anyone realizes. Over the next 6 weeks, I transformed from a passive victim into an active investigator. I could not run the company with my shares frozen, but I could still access Charles's personal files. I spent hours in his study, going through years of documents, looking for anything that might help. Diane became my right hand. She had skills I never expected, research abilities from her paralegal days that proved invaluable. Together, we built a timeline of everything that had happened in the Webb family over the past 5 years. Meanwhile, my investigation team was digging into Nicole Ashford's past. What they found was disturbing. Nicole had not just appeared out of nowhere. She had systematically positioned herself to meet Bradley Webb. For working at Webb Maritime, she had been fired from 2 other companies for inappropriate relationships with executives. David told me during one of our strategy meetings. In both cases, the men were married. In both cases, there were financial settlements when she threatened to go public. "So she is a professional homewrecker," I said. "It gets worse. David slid a photograph across the table. This is from a yacht party 3 years ago. Recognize anyone? I studied the image. There was Nicole, several years younger, laughing on the deck of a massive yacht. And standing next to her, his arm around her waist, was a man I recognized immediately. That is Charles, I whispered. David nodded. Nicole had an affair with Charles Webb before she ever met Bradley. The room spun. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. Wait, I said. Charles and Nicole? But it means Nicole may have been targeting the Webb family long before Bradley was in the picture. David pulled out more photographs, more documents. According to our sources, Charles ended the affair abruptly about 2.5 years ago, right around the time you started spending more time with him during his illness. He chose me over her, I realized. He saw who she really was, and she may have resented you for it. David's expression was grim. Elena, there is something else. We have been looking into Charles's death. The official cause was cardiac arrest. I know. I was there when the doctors told us. Our medical expert reviewed the autopsy report. He thinks there are some irregularities. The potassium levels in Charles's blood were abnormally high. What does that mean? It could mean nothing. Some medications can affect potassium levels, but it could also indicate poisoning. Certain substances can induce cardiac arrest and mimic natural heart failure. I felt cold all over. Are you saying Charles was murdered? I am saying we cannot rule it out, and I think we need to bring in law enforcement. 2 days later, I was sitting across from Detective Roy Campbell of the Seattle Police Department. He was in his early 50s with a weathered face and tired eyes that had clearly seen too much. He also had a habit of quoting country music lyrics, which I found oddly comforting. Mrs. Webb, Detective Campbell said, flipping through the file I had provided. This is quite a collection of information you have here. I want to know the truth about my father-in-law's death, I said, and I think Nicole Ashford might be involved. He raised an eyebrow. That is a serious accusation. You got any proof beyond suspicion? Not yet. That is why I am coming to you. Detective Campbell leaned back in his chair. You know what Dolly Parton says? Find out who you are and do it on purpose. He smiled slightly. My third ex-wife loved that quote. Point is, Mrs. Webb, you seem like someone who is trying real hard to figure out the truth. I respect that. Most rich folks just want their problems to go away. I am not most rich folks, I said. I was a waitress 6 years ago, so I heard. He closed the file. I will look into this. Quietly. Cannot promise anything, but if there is something here, I will find it. You should know, though, investigations like this take time. Could be months before we have answers. I can wait, I said. I have been waiting my whole life. As I left the police station, my phone buzzed. A text from Diane. Come back to the office. Found something important in Charles's personal files. You need to see this. I arrived 20 minutes later to find Diane in Charles's study, surrounded by boxes of papers. She looked exhausted but excited. What did you find, then? I asked. She handed me a stack of documents. Charles was keeping his own investigation files. He knew. Elena, he knew everything. I flipped through the pages, financial records showing Bradley's embezzlement, photographs of Nicole at various events, medical reports, legal documents, private investigator notes. And at the very bottom, a letter addressed to me. Dear Elena, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are fighting for your life against my family. I am sorry I could not protect you better, but I have left you the weapons you need. Everything is documented. Everything can be proven. Trust no one except Diane and Thomas. They have been loyal to me for 20 years, and they will be loyal to you. And remember, Nicole Ashford is not who she claims to be. She came into this family with a plan, and I fear that plan involves more than just money. Be careful, be smart, and never forget that you deserve so much better than my son. With love and faith in you. Charles, I read the letter 3 times. Then I handed it to Diane. He knew, I said quietly. He knew Nicole was dangerous, and he tried to warn me. There is more, Diane said. Look at the last page of his investigator's report. I turned to it. The page was dated just 4 days before Charles died. It detailed a meeting between Nicole and a man named Richard Kozloff, a known associate of organized crime figures in Seattle. Why would Nicole be meeting with a mobster, I asked. Money, Diane suggested. Protection? Or maybe she was planning something bigger than any of us realized. My phone rang. It was Detective Campbell. "Mrs. Webb," he said without preamble, "I just got the results from an independent autopsy review. Charles Webb did not die of natural causes. The potassium levels in his system are consistent with an injection of potassium chloride. Your father-in-law was murdered. The Webb Maritime Annual Charity Gala was the social event of the Seattle season. 500 guests in designer clothes, a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers, and more money changing hands in a single night than most people saw in a lifetime. It was also the perfect stage for a public confrontation. I spent weeks preparing. With my shares still frozen, I could not make business decisions, but I could still attend company events. Margaret tried to have me removed from the guest list, but since Charles had technically left me in charge, the event planners were not sure whose orders to follow. In the end, they let me come. Diane helped me choose my dress. Emerald green, elegant but not flashy, with a subtle cut that revealed my now visible pregnancy bump. I was 6 months along, and there was no hiding it anymore. I decided to stop trying. "Are you sure about this?" Diane asked as she helped me with my earrings. "Walking into the lion's den with evidence of murder seems dangerous." I met her eyes in the mirror. "Detective Campbell is stationed at the gala with backup. The moment we have what we need, he will move in. And if something goes wrong?" Then at least I went down fighting. The ballroom was exactly as I remembered from years of standing in the corner trying to be invisible. Crystal and gold everywhere. Waiters circulating with champagne. The orchestra playing something classical and forgettable. And everywhere I looked, people who had ignored me for years now staring with undisguised curiosity. I walked in alone. Thomas was nearby, dressed as a waiter, keeping watch. Diane was in the control room, monitoring the security feeds. "Elena," a familiar voice made me turn. Marcus stood there in a tuxedo that did not quite fit right. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed and thin. Gambling addiction and guilt were taking their toll. "Marcus," I said coolly, "I did not expect to see you here. Mother made me come." He could not meet my eyes. "Elena, I need to tell you something. You already told me plenty at the hearing, I know, but there is more." He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a quiet corner. "Nicole is planning something tonight. I do not know what, but I heard her on the phone. She said something about ending this once and for all." My blood went cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have done enough terrible things." He finally looked at me. "I cannot be responsible for more. Whatever happens tonight, be careful." Before I could respond, the lights dimmed, a spotlight hit the stage, and Margaret Webb stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said in her most gracious voice, "welcome to the annual Webb Maritime Charity Gala. As you know, this year has brought great changes to our family. We lost my beloved husband Charles, and we have faced challenges that have tested us all." She paused dramatically. "But the Webb family endures. We are stronger than ever. And tonight, I am proud to announce that after a thorough legal review, the courts have determined that my husband's final will was influenced by outside parties. The shares of Webb Maritime Industries will be returned to their rightful owners, the Webb family." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. That was not true. The court case was not decided yet. She was lying. But before I could react, the large screen behind the stage flickered. The Webb Maritime logo disappeared. In its place appeared a grainy photograph, a mugshot, a young woman who looked like me, and text that read, "Elena Carter, age 19, charges, possession with intent to distribute cocaine." I heard gasps. Someone dropped a glass. The sound of shattering crystal was very loud in the sudden silence. Richard stepped forward from the crowd, feigning shock. "Oh my God, Elena, is this why you hid your past? You were a drug dealer?" I stared at the screen. The photograph was real, taken from my actual arrest, but the charges were wrong. I had been arrested for shoplifting, not drugs. Someone had altered the document. "Bradley," I said loudly enough for people nearby to hear. "You know that is fake. You know what I was actually arrested for." He smiled at me. The same smile he had given me on our wedding day, cold and hollow. "I know what the document says," he replied, "and I know our board cannot have a drug dealer as CEO." The crowd was buzzing now. Phones were out. This was going to be all over the news within minutes. But I was not afraid, because I had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Thomas," I said calmly, "play the video." The screen flickered again. The fake mugshot vanished. A new image appeared. Security camera footage from what looked like a cheap internet cafe. Timestamp: 3 days ago. In the video, Bradley sat at a computer next to a man in a hoodie. Their voices were captured perfectly. "Make sure this mugshot looks bad," Bradley was saying. "Add bags under her eyes. Change the charge to cocaine. The board needs to think she is a drug dealer." "This will cost extra," the man replied. "Faking a police database is a felony. Just do it. I need her destroyed by the gala." The ballroom went completely silent. Bradley's face drained of color. He backed away, knocking into a waiter and sending a tray of champagne crashing to the floor. "That is faked," he stammered. "That video is manipulated." I stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said clearly, "my actual arrest at age 19 was for stealing baby formula and diapers for a neighbor's hungry child. The charges were dropped. The document you just saw was created by my husband to destroy my reputation." I paused, looking around the room at the shocked faces. "But that is not the most important crime committed tonight." "What are you talking about?" Margaret's voice was shrill. "I am talking about murder." The screen changed again. This time it showed Nicole Ashford meeting with a man in a parking garage. Then Nicole purchasing something at a pharmacy. Then Nicole entering the Webb mansion through a service entrance on the night Charles died. Nicole Ashford had an affair with Charles Webb 3 years ago, I announced. When he ended it, she became obsessed. She positioned herself to meet Bradley and began planning her revenge. "That is insane," Nicole screamed from somewhere in the crowd. "She is lying. The potassium chloride that stopped Charles Webb's heart was purchased by Nicole Ashford 2 weeks before his death," I continued. "Her fingerprints were found on his water glass. She poisoned him and framed me, hoping I would take the blame while she walked away with Bradley and the family fortune." Detective Campbell stepped forward from the edge of the room, badge visible. "Nicole Ashford, you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Webb." "No," Nicole's voice rose to a shriek. "No, you cannot prove anything." "Bradley, tell them. Tell them we planned this together." Bradley's face went white. "I do not know what she is talking about." "You told me to do it." Nicole was being handcuffed now, struggling against the officers. "You said if we got rid of Elena, we would have everything. You said your father was already dying anyway." "I never said that." Bradley looked around desperately. "She is crazy. I had nothing to do with any murder." Detective Campbell looked at him with something like pity. "Mr. Webb, we recovered text messages between you and Ms. Ashford from the night your father died. You wrote, and I quote, 'Let this play out. Either way we win. We will have questions for you as well.'" As officers moved toward Bradley, I looked at Margaret. She stood frozen at the edge of the stage, her perfect facade cracking. "You knew," I said to her quietly. "You knew Nicole was dangerous. You knew she was in this family for money. And you did nothing because you thought you could use her." Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Charles documented everything." I held up the folder of evidence. "He knew what all of you were capable of. He tried to protect me because he knew I was the only one in this family worth protecting." I turned to the crowd of stunned guests. "The gala is over," I announced. "Thank you all for coming." The next few weeks were a hurricane of legal proceedings, press coverage, and emotional exhaustion. Nicole Ashford was charged with first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, financial records, the poison purchase, and ultimately her own panicked confession on the night of the gala. She tried to claim that Bradley had pressured her into it, but her own text messages showed she had been planning Charles's death for months before telling Bradley anything. Bradley was arrested as an accessory after the fact. He had not planned the murder, but when Nicole confessed to him what she had done, he had chosen to protect her rather than seek justice for his own father. His text messages, his silence, his willingness to let me take the blame, all of it painted a picture of a man willing to sacrifice anything for money. Margaret was not charged with any crime, but her reputation was destroyed. The woman who had spent 40 years building herself up as Seattle society royalty was now exposed as someone who had enabled her son's affair, ignored warning signs about Nicole, and tried to steal her husband's legacy from the woman he actually trusted. The court case against me was dismissed. With the evidence of Bradley's frame job and Nicole's murder exposed, no judge would touch Margaret's undue influence claim. My shares were unfrozen. I was officially and permanently the CEO of Webb Maritime Industries. But none of that mattered as much as what happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. My water broke at 7:15 in the morning. Diane drove me to the hospital, breaking approximately 12 traffic laws in the process. "You are going to be fine," she kept saying. "Breathe, just breathe." "I am breathing," I replied through gritted teeth. "I am also in a significant amount of pain." The delivery took 14 hours. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than testifying in court. Harder than facing Bradley's lawyers. Harder than standing up in that ballroom and exposing the truth. But at 9:32 in the evening, I held my daughter in my arms for the first time. She was 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had dark hair like me and blue eyes that the nurses said might change color later. She was perfect. "What is her name?" Diane asked, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the tiny bundle in my arms. "Charlotte," I said. "Charlotte Rose Webb. After Charles, he saved my life. I want her to know that." Diane smiled. "Charlotte Rose. That is beautiful." In the days that followed, I stayed in the hospital room with my daughter. Thomas stood guard outside, even though I told him it was not necessary. Diane handled the press, who were desperate for photos and statements. I refused all interviews. On the third day, I had an unexpected visitor. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, looking like he had not slept in weeks. He held a small teddy bear in his hands. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He walked over and looked at Charlotte, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. "She is beautiful," he said. "She is," I agreed. He set the teddy bear down carefully. "Elena, I do not expect you to forgive me. What I did at the hearing, it was cowardly and wrong. But I want you to know that I am done being that person. I checked myself into rehab yesterday. For real this time." "Good," he looked at me. "I do not deserve your help or your trust. But if there is ever anything I can do to make up for what I did, I will do it. I owe you that. I owe Charles that." I studied his face. He looked sincere. But I had been fooled before. "Prove it," I said finally. "Finish rehab, get clean, stay clean, and then maybe we can talk about what comes next." He nodded. "Thank you. That is more than I deserve." After he left, I sat with Charlotte and thought about the strange turns life can take. A year ago, I was invisible, a servant in my own home, married to a man who despised me, tolerated by a family that treated me like trash. Now I was a mother, a CEO, a survivor, and I was done letting anyone else define my worth. 6 months later, Webb Maritime Industries looked like a completely different company. I had renamed it Harbor Industries, wanting to distance the business from the scandal and tragedy that had engulfed the Webb name. Some board members resisted at first, but I reminded them that I owned 60% of the company and could do whatever I wanted. The resistance stopped quickly after that. I brought in new leadership, people who cared about more than just profit. I implemented environmental standards that Bradley had blocked for years, converting our shipping fleet to cleaner fuel sources. I started a profit-sharing program for employees, something Charles had wanted to do, but Margaret had always vetoed. And I promoted Diane to vice president of operations. "You cannot be serious," she said when I told her. "I was a housekeeper 6 months ago. And before that, you were a paralegal," I reminded her. "You have more business sense than half the executives in this building. Plus, you are the only person here I actually trust." She accepted the position. On her first day, she walked into the executive boardroom and told a room full of men twice her age exactly how we were going to restructure the supply chain. Half of them looked like they wanted to argue. None of them did. I kept Thomas on as head of security, though his job had become less about physical protection and more about making sure no one was embezzling company funds. It turned out that years of driving Charles around had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of the business. When I was married to Bradley, Thomas told me one afternoon, I learned to pay attention without looking like I was paying attention. Rich people say a lot of things when they think no one important is listening. I smiled. Good thing for me you were listening. Mr. Charles thought so too. The legal proceedings against Bradley and Nicole dragged on for months. Nicole eventually pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, accepting life in prison without parole. In her final statement before sentencing, she said she had loved Charles and could not bear watching him choose someone else over her. I do not believe that was love. Love does not poison someone. Love does not frame an innocent person for murder. Whatever Nicole felt for Charles, it was obsession mixed with entitlement, the same toxic combination that had defined the entire Webb family. Bradley received 8 years in federal prison for embezzlement and accessory after the fact. It was less than I thought he deserved, but his lawyers were good, and he had never actually participated in the murder itself, just covered it up. On the day of his sentencing, I went to the courthouse, not to gloat, just to see it end. He looked smaller in his prison jumpsuit. The golden boy sheen had worn away, leaving behind a middle-aged man who had lost everything because he could not see value in anything except money. Our eyes met across the courtroom. He did not say anything. Neither did I. What was there to say? Margaret Webb did not go to prison, but she lost almost everything else. The legal fees from defending herself and Bradley consumed most of her assets. She was forced to sell the Seattle mansion and move into a small apartment in Florida, living on what remained of the stipend Charles had left her. I heard she tried to write a tell-all book about the scandal. No publisher would touch it. Marcus, to his credit, actually followed through on his promise. He completed a 90-day rehabilitation program and stayed clean afterward. I gave him a call in the company mailroom, starting at entry level. He took it without complaint. Every month we had lunch together. Not because we were close, but because I believed in second chances. Charles had given me one. Maybe Marcus deserved one too. "You are not what I expected," Marcus told me during one of these lunches. "When you first took over, I thought you would burn everything down. Fire everyone. Take revenge on all of us." I thought about it, I admitted, but revenge does not fix anything. It just creates more damage. "Then what does fix things?" "Building something better," I said. "Making sure the next generation does not repeat the same mistakes." He looked at the photo on my desk. Charlotte at 6 months old, grinning her toothless grin at the camera. "She is lucky," Marcus said quietly, "to have you as a mother." "I am the lucky one," I replied. Charlotte's first birthday party was held in Charles's garden. My garden now. We kept it small. Diane and her daughter Sophia, Thomas and his wife, a few colleagues from the office who had become genuine friends. Marcus, sober for 13 months now, and looking healthier than I had ever seen him. No press, no socialites. No one who was there because they wanted something from me. Just people who actually cared. I watched Charlotte toddle across the grass, chasing bubbles that Sophia was blowing for her. The sun was shining, a rare gift in Seattle. The roses Charles had planted decades ago were in full bloom. "He would have loved this," Thomas said, appearing beside me with a glass of lemonade. I smiled. "I think he planned it this way." How so? He knew what his family was capable of, but he also knew I would survive them. He told me once that I had something they did not have. What is that? The ability to care about something other than money. I took a sip of lemonade. I did not understand what he meant at the time, but I think I do now. Bradley and Margaret and Nicole, they spent their whole lives chasing wealth and status, and in the end they had nothing. No real relationships, no real love, no one who would stand by them when things got hard. "And you?" Thomas asked. I looked around the garden, at Diane laughing with her daughter, at Marcus helping Charlotte pick a dandelion, at the blue sky and the blooming roses and the simple beauty of an ordinary afternoon. "I have everything," I said. That night, after everyone had gone home and Charlotte was asleep in her crib, I sat in Charles's study. I had kept most of his books, his desk, his old leather chair. It still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. I pulled out the letter he had written me, the one I had found in his files during those desperate weeks of investigation. I had read it hundreds of times by now, but I still found comfort in his words. "Dear Elena, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you are fighting for your life against my family. I am sorry I could not protect you better, but I have left you the weapons you need. Trust no one except Diane and Thomas, and never forget that you deserve so much better than my son." I set the letter aside and looked at the framed photograph on the desk. Charles and me, taken at a company picnic 2 years before he died. He was laughing at something I had said. It was one of the few photos where I was genuinely smiling. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room, "for everything." The next morning, I had a meeting with a man named Daniel Carter. He was the CEO of a sustainable shipping company based in Portland, and he wanted to discuss a potential partnership between our organizations. I expected a boring business meeting. What I got was something different. Daniel Carter was in his early 40s, tall and slightly disheveled, in a way that suggested he cared more about substance than appearance. He had kind eyes and a quick smile, and within 10 minutes of our meeting, he had made me laugh twice. Not a nervous laugh or a polite laugh, a real laugh, the kind I had almost forgotten how to produce. "You are not what I expected," he said as we walked through the Harbor Industries warehouse. "I get that a lot. What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone harder, maybe. You have been through hell this past year. It is all over the news. But you seem, and I hope this is not offensive, almost happy." I considered the question. I think I am happy, for the first time in a long time. I spent years trying to be what other people wanted. Now I am just trying to be myself, Daniel nodded. "That is harder than it sounds. It is the hardest thing I have ever done." We ended up talking for 3 hours. About business, yes, but also about our lives. His failed marriage. My disastrous one. His daughter, 12 years old and obsessed with marine biology. My Charlotte, 1 year old and obsessed with anything she could put in her mouth. "This is unusual," he said as we finally wrapped up. "I came here to talk about shipping routes, and instead I feel like I just had therapy." I smiled. "Good therapy or bad therapy?" "The good kind." He paused. "Would you maybe want to continue this conversation over dinner sometime?" "Not a business dinner, just dinner." I looked at him. A year ago, I would have said no automatically. I would have been too afraid, too damaged, too convinced that I did not deserve anything good. But I was not that person anymore. "I would like that," I said. 1 year after that first dinner, Daniel and I were still together. He never tried to change me, never suggested I work less or dress differently or be someone other than who I was. He loved me, Charlotte included, exactly as we were, messy and complicated and still healing from old wounds. "We are not rushing into anything," I told Diane when she asked about our future. "I learned from my first marriage that rushing is a mistake." Diane smiled. "From what I have seen, that man looks at you like you hung the moon. Take your time, but do not take too much time." Charlotte was 2 years old now, talking in full sentences and asking why approximately 400 times a day. She had my dark hair and Charles's stubborn chin. She called Diane Auntie D and Marcus Uncle Mark and demanded to be carried everywhere, even though she could walk perfectly fine. She was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Harbor Industries continued to grow. Our environmental initiatives attracted positive press coverage and new clients who cared about sustainability. We expanded into renewable energy, partnering with wind farm operators and solar panel manufacturers. The company that Charles Webb built with one rusty fishing boat was now at the forefront of the clean energy revolution. Margaret Webb died on a Tuesday in February, a heart attack, just like Charles. Except she died alone in her small Florida apartment, undiscovered for 3 days. I did not go to the funeral. Neither did Marcus. We sent flowers out of obligation, but neither of us mourned. "Is that terrible?" Marcus asked me. "That I feel nothing?" "I think it is human," I replied. "She spent her whole life pushing people away. In the end, she got exactly what she created." Bradley was released from prison after serving 5 years of his 8-year sentence. Good behavior. He tried to contact me once, sending a letter to the company headquarters. I did not read it. I had Thomas return it unopened. Some doors are better left closed. Nicole Ashford will spend the rest of her life in prison. I do not think about her much. She was a symptom of a larger disease, the worship of wealth and status that had corrupted the entire Webb family. She was not the cause. People sometimes ask me what I learned from everything that happened. Usually reporters writing follow-up stories or business students studying the case as an example of corporate governance gone wrong. I always give them the same answer. I learned that being underestimated is a superpower. When people look at you and see nothing, they stop guarding their words. They stop hiding their schemes. They tell you exactly who they are because they do not think you are important enough to matter. And when they finally realize their mistake, it is too late. I also learned that forgiveness is not about the other person. It is about yourself. I do not forgive Bradley because he deserves it. I forgive him because carrying that anger would poison me the way Nicole's obsession poisoned her. I choose peace. Every day, I choose peace. And I learned that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who knows her worth. Not because she is vengeful or cruel, but because she cannot be bought, cannot be manipulated, cannot be convinced that she deserves less than everything. The ignored wife walked into that will reading expecting nothing. She walked out owning everything. But the real inheritance was not the money or the company. It was learning that I was enough, and I had been enough all along. On Charlotte's third birthday, we held another party in the garden. Bigger this time. More friends, more laughter, more joy. Daniel was there, helping Marcus set up the bounce house we had rented. Diane was organizing the food with the same military precision she applied to quarterly reports. Thomas was teaching Sophia how to play croquet. And I was sitting on the garden bench, Charlotte in my lap, reading her favorite book for the 100th time. "Mama," she said, interrupting my reading, "why is there a picture of the old man on your desk?" I looked at where she was pointing, toward the study window visible from the garden. The framed photo of Charles was just barely visible. "That is your grandfather," I told her. "His name was Charles. He loved this garden very much." "Did he love me?" I kissed the top of her head. "He would have loved you more than anything in the world." "Good." She nodded with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old. "I love him too." I held her tight and watched Daniel wave at us from across the lawn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The roses were blooming. The people I loved were all around me. 6 years ago, I was a waitress in Tulsa, dreaming of a better life. 4 years ago, I was invisible, standing in the corner of my own house, wondering if I would ever be seen. 2 years ago, I was fighting for my life against people who wanted to destroy me. And now I was home. The ignored wife, the waitress from Oklahoma, the woman they all underestimated. She had won, not through revenge, not through cruelty, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to disappear. And she was just getting started. And that is the story of Elena Webb, the waitress from Oklahoma who refused to disappear. Now I have a question for you. What would you have done in her shoes? Would you have taken the $5 million and walked away? Or would you have fought back like she did? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you feel something, if you were rooting for Elena, if you wanted to see those villains get exactly what they deserved, do me a small favor. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it helps more people discover stories like this. Subscribe if you want more karma, more revenge, and more women who refuse to be underestimated. I will see you in the next one.